So I would say that we would still give a primacy to Scripture.
Okay. Awesome. Also, speaking of scripture, since we there, do y'all have the same canon as the Catholic Church? If I'm not mistaken, the Catholic Church has the Book of Maccabees in their canon, which is very interesting since the Book of never mind. But
right, it's the Hanukkah, yeah.
Yeah. But and it's about what Hanukkah was about. But do you do y'all have the same canon as the Catholic Church? Do y'all have something different? Do you have more books, less books? You know, what's that?
We do pretty much have the same canon. There's a little bit of a divergence because we have third Maccabees in our Bible and Catholics don't, to my knowledge. Although Catholics are they're kind of flexible on this because amongst Roman Catholics, you have a group that are called Uniates, or they're called Eastern Catholics. And these are people who are Orthodox in different centuries who joined back with the Pope. So the Roman Catholic Church has flexibility because some of those Uniates, I assume, would have the same couple extra books as the Orthodox Church. But because the normative Bible for the Orthodox in terms of the Old Testament is the Septuagint included all the deuterocanonical, what are called the deuterocanon or the apocrypha in the West.
Enoch.
So yes, we have all those books.
Okay, awesome. That means y'all have the Book of Enoch also.
No, Enoch is different.
Okay. So y'all don't. So that's one of the books that's just apocrypha.
Well,
what? Go ahead.
Well, one thing I would say about Enoch is that so Enoch is usually classed. There's a separate class of these that are called pseudepigrapha, and pseudepigrapha are the books that are believed to have the name of a famous person or apostle, but not be written by them. So, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, right? These are called pseudepigrapha, and but the Book of Enoch, because it's cited in Jude, we do think that it contains tradition. And so for us, there's tradition outside of the Bible that's absolutely legitimate. So we don't have a problem citing Enoch as a part of tradition, but it's not part of the canon of Scripture.
So what books that outside the 66 books that we all read, just for people listening, what other books do y'all read out of outside of the Maccabees?
Well, for us, Maccabees is part of the Bible, so it wouldn't be. So there's all those other deuterocanonical books like Judith, Tobit, Sirach, Wisdom, Bel and the Dragon, which is an extra chapter of Daniel. All of those are part of our Bible. We do think that they're secondary canon. They're not as important as the Gospels or important as the Law of Moses, but they're in there, and they're typically classed as instructional or catechetical texts. Particularly Sirach is really good for catechesis and just practical life advice. It's just like more proverbs, basically. But outside of the Scripture, there's not like a definitive list of what we consider acceptable. It's more so that those books can and may and would contain elements of tradition. So like we wouldn't say that the Book of Enoch is like, we wouldn't cite it to prove a doctrine. But in a speculative sense, there could be aspects to which, the Book of Enoch is describing things that are true. Like, Genesis 6 is talking about angels, in my view, and women. And, Enoch backs that up. So it would be a thing that sort of backs up stuff, but not 100% certain. And then, Scripture itself talks about like Jude talks about the Testament of Moses. There's another there's a couple books like this cited in the New Testament that are not part of the canon. There's references to proto-evangelium of James is mentioned in the New Testament, which we don't think is canonical, but we can cite these as sort of elements of tradition, so to speak. But there's not any hard and fast list of like these kinds of books.
Okay, now I want to go back to the Eucharist a little bit. And a few people told me to ask this. So y'all take the Eucharist as literal. My question is, it is true that sometimes in the New Testament, Jesus talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, things of that nature, blatantly symbolic in the New Testament. So what the question is why do y'all view it as literal in this case?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I was raised Protestant, so I grew up Baptist and then got into like a hardcore Calvinist stuff in my 20s. And so I have a background in like fighting against this idea that it's a real presence. So I understand what people have the issue with this, but for one, if from our perspective, when you take a totality view of the Old and the New Testament and you look at what Christ came to do, from our perspective, when you understand that what we think he intended to do was to heal and restore our nature. This is why for us, the incarnation is incarnation and resurrection are the two most important doctrines, because in the notion of the second person of Godhead taking on human nature, we think that he immediately healed and deified it in that sense. And so we need to partake of that and participate in that restored, and not just restored, but actually deified human nature. That doesn't mean that it ceases to be a creature or anything like that. For us, deification just means that it's partaking of divine life, partaking of immortality, partaking of eternity, and being what it was always intended to be. So it's not that humans become the divine essence. We think that the essence energy distinction is important here, because we're not partaking of God's essence, but we are partaking of his uncreated energies. And so the means by which we partake of those uncreated energies are multiple, but it's not just a mental assent. Like a lot of times in the Protestant world, we do agree that the mental assent to the teachings, faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word. We agree with that, but we think there's more than that, which is that God didn't just make us as minds, he made us also as bodies. And so the second person of Godhead taking on a human body necessitates, in our view, also us participating in not just Christ's uncreated immaterial aspect, his uncreated divinity, but also in his physicality, in his bodily existence. And so we think that the Eucharist is a participation in both of those aspects of Christ. And so St. Cyril at the Council of Ephesus famously said body, blood, soul, and divinity. And where we disagree with the Roman Catholics on this is that they'll use that same phrase, but we think the divinity there that we're partaking of is the uncreated energies. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't really have an energies doctrine, but St. Cyril in Ephesus said that the energies are what's present. So it's body, blood, soul, and divinity. The uncreated energy is what turns it into his deified flesh. And so by partaking of that deified flesh, we're partaking of that restored, deified human nature. And that's what unites us to Christ, as well as the other things too. So it's not like an either or, like it's just a mental thing. It's a mental and a bodily thing. And that's why we think Jesus was constantly using created things to teach. He spits in the mud. He uses water, uses wine, uses these physical things, because we think God is affirming the goodness of created existence and ultimately pointing to the need for us to participate in his actual human nature.